Sponsored by the James Madison Council.
Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm Sari Horwitz. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post, and I'm here with Patrick Radden Keefe and Eyre to talk about their books on the opioid epidemic, which has claimed the lives of more than 500,000 people nationwide, the worst drug overdose epidemic in American history. I've spent the last 3 years reporting for the Washington Post investigative team about the opioid crisis, and I'm actually already writing a book myself on the epidemic with my colleague Scott Hyam. So I'm particularly thrilled to introduce you to two authors whose work and books I greatly admire. Patrick Radden Keefe, an award-winning writer at The New Yorker, is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. And Eyre, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on opioids at the Charleston Gazette-Mail and is now a reporter at the Mountain State Spotlight in West Virginia, is the author of Death in Mudlick, a coal country fight against the drug companies that developed the opioid epidemic. Patrick, let me start with you and your devastating, absolutely devastating portrait of the Sackler family and their role in the opioid epidemic. Can you give us a brief description of Empire of Pain and tell us what led you to write this book?
Absolutely. I should say, first of all, I'm really humbled and honored to share a panel with the two of you, two people who have written such amazing stuff on this issue. The opioid crisis is so big as an issue that I feel as though different parts of it have been worked over by different people in different ways. There are great books on the opioid crisis. I wanted to look pretty closely at the perpetrators. And so I was very interested in this family, the Sackler family, who own Purdue Pharma, this Connecticut pharmaceutical company that produces OxyContin that a lot of people think of as sort of the tip of the spear of the crisis, the drug that really started us on the road to where we are today. And so it's not an opioid crisis book per se. It's actually a sort of a broad look at 3 generations of this family. It's more of a family saga. But I think there's all sorts of things in the history of this family that help explain the ways in which our treatment of pain and our use of medicine has been kind of hijacked by commerce and by big pharma. And so in that sense, it's kind of an origin story for the opioid crisis, told through the lens of this one particular family.
Eric, can you tell us the story of Death in Mudlick? What is this book about, and what led you to write this account of Debbie Priest's fight for justice? You know, Patrick's book, I think, focuses a lot on the causes, and your book, you know, seems to describe the effect. Tell us about Death in Mudlick.
Sure, Sari. And I'm also honored to be here with you too. Sari has done incredible work on the opioid epidemic. And I have a confession to make. When I saw Patrick's book was coming out, I thought I knew everything about the epidemic. Well, I was totally wrong. He's got revelation after revelation. You could just pretty much pluck any page out and you'd be like, oh my God, or you got to be kidding me. Just incredible, incredible work. Basically, I describe my book as a David and Goliath, David versus Goliath tale in which a small group of Appalachians get together and take on the giants of the opioid industry. It starts out in the southern coal fields of West Virginia, where a coal miner dies of an OxyContin overdose named Bull Priest, and it's in a holler named Mudlick, which explains the title. Then his sister, Debbie Priest, she's really fiery. She's like this Aaron Brockovich type character. And she decides that you know, she's not going to let her brother become another statistic. She's going to avenge his death. And she connects with a lawyer by the name of Jim Cagle, who she had known for years, going back 30 years when she was actually arrested on drug conspiracy charges. And the two of them get together and they first file suit against the doctor that prescribed the OxyContin to Bull Priest. And then they file against a pharmacy, infamous pharmacy, and then they go to other pharmacies. But it doesn't stop there. Debbie has this question, asking the question, where are all these painkillers coming from? She didn't know if they were coming from UPS or Fed Express or the United States Postal Service. Who knew? So she actually took it upon herself to get in a car and follow some of the delivery trucks that came around the county, and she had the license plate traced to a company called Cardinal Health, which turns out is one of the biggest opioid distributors in the country. And from there, they go up and up the chain, the supply chain. And there's kind of a subplot too of the power of local news reporting, in particular watchdog reporting. My story started with a tip at the newspaper about the new attorney general that was elected, and he had strong ties to the pharmaceutical distributors, and he inherited a lawsuit that was filed by his predecessor. Anyway, to sum it up, took several months, if not a year, to pry loose some documents related to the total numbers of shipments of opioids to all the counties in West Virginia. And what we saw was shocking. It was upwards of 78 million pain pills. Essentially, the drug distributors had flooded the state with painkillers. And these were both OxyContin and hydrocodone. And if you take those drugs in large amounts, you literally stop breathing and you die. And that's what was happening all over West Virginia. We had reached all-time highs in overdose deaths, and the problem didn't seem to be getting any better. And also the data we saw was that most of these shipments went to mom-and-pop drugstores. They were independently owned. And in one case, we had situations like a town in Kermit, West Virginia, which has a population of 400, had 12 million opioids sent to the lone pharmacy in town. That's 12 million OxyContin and hydrocodone over the course of 3 years to a town of 400 people. And the story just sort of builds like a snowball, and eventually winds its way all the way up to where the CEOs are in Capitol Hill and the giant distributors face their day of reckoning.
Unbelievable numbers, Eric. I just wanted to say, I forgot to say that for all you who are watching this interview, you can submit questions, and the last 10 minutes, I'll take your questions to Patrick and Eric. The theme of the National Book Festival this year is open a book, open the world. So in keeping with that theme, Patrick, how have books opened the world for you?
It's funny, I knew this was a theme, and I thought about talking about books that meant a lot to me when I was young, but what I want to say is actually something slightly different, which is that I spent so much of my time on a phone and on screens. And increasingly, what books are to me is this time when I step away from that. And it might seem perverse, right? Because you're kind of unplugging. In some ways, you're sort of removing yourself from the world in the sense of any information you want being instantly findable at your fingertips, or people emailing you or texting you. But it becomes this time out where I can actually, just sort of start breathing normally and feel as though my heart rate is getting back to normal. And that does open up worlds to me. It makes me kind of see the world and appreciate it again. And the same goes for my family. I have small kids, and I read to them. And it's the same thing. It becomes this kind of safe haven and a way in which I can sort of reacquaint myself with the world in a way that's not mediated by a screen, which feels like a very precious thing these days.
That's great, Patrick. I know that feeling exactly, that kind of escape. And Eric, what influence have books had on you and your writing?
Well, I hate to admit it, but when I was growing up as a boy, I read very few books other than probably the Hardy Boys. I went through the Hardy Boys pretty quickly. But when I was in college, my parents moved to a small town in Indiana called Logansport. About 17,000 people live in Logansport. And they had moved from Philadelphia, where my dad was a factory worker, to Logansport, Indiana. And I didn't have much to do, except for during the day I baled hay, and then in the afternoon and evening, I decided to head down to the local library in Logansport. For a community of its size, it was an incredibly well-stocked library, and the librarian, thank God for librarians, she introduced me to an Indiana writer by the name of Scott Russell Sanders, who writes, I was really interested actually in his science fiction, and he also does a lot of nonfiction essays. And my next step was, after I read all of his works at the time, I decided to write him a letter. This is pre email, so you actually had to write a physical letter, and he wrote back, and he said thanks, and said that he thought I might be interested in some other authors, and he gave a list, included Ursula Le Guin, Leslie Marmon Silko, Toni Morrison, Charles Johnson, Tim O'Brien, and T.C. Boyle. And those are the books that really opened up the world to me, actually the universe. I just read and read and read, baled hay, read, baled hay, read. Sometimes I'd read the same book 2 or 3 times. And I think that kind of planted the seed that if I could write anywhere even close to some of these writers, and I don't say I can, but at least I could ply my way in the field of journalism, and I did. I wound up at a small newspaper in Alabama, and so they planted the seed, and I thought, just maybe that, now that looking back on it, that maybe that also is an inspiration for writing my first book at age 55.
I'm going to ask you both a question about, it's sort of an impact question, or a question about something that may have happened while you were doing your work. Patrick, in Empire of Pain, you take on 3 generations of the powerful Sackler family. And I'm wondering, because I've had experiences in my own writing and reporting, did you ever feel threatened or intimidated by the Sackler family, or the lawyers for the Sackler family, or lawyers for Purdue?
Well, I mean, the first thing I should say, just for the sake of clarity, so I wrote this big book about 3 generations of this family, but the family wouldn't talk to me. They didn't want me to write the book. And they started threatening to sue me, actually, even before I had started writing. It was announced publicly that I was writing the book, and that's when the legal threats started coming, and they continued over the next couple of years. There was an incident that I described at the end of the book. Pardon me?
What sort of legal threats?
There were these long, tendentious letters, objecting to my reporting in the past in the New Yorker, and sort of making all kinds of ominous noises about what would happen if I didn't get things right. And there's a kind of a crazy thing called the litigation hold, where what they did was they wrote to me and they said, we may be suing you, so what we need you to do is not destroy any evidence that could be used in that eventual lawsuit. So don't destroy any scrap of paper, don't delete any emails. You need to hold on to all this stuff because it's going to be evidence if and when we bring a lawsuit against you. And you two will appreciate that as a reporter. I mean, on the one hand, this is no big deal. I was happy to keep all this stuff. But I did have these funny moments along the way that at one point a source got in touch with me. This is during the pandemic. And said, I have 40 boxes of documents that I want to give to you. I'm going to send them to your home. And I told my wife, I was excited at the thought of 40 boxes of documents, legal documents. And I told my wife, we're going to get a delivery of 40 boxes of documents, and we can never throw them away because I have this litigation hold. And she said, not going to happen. There's not room for 40 boxes of documents in the house. So I ended up having to fly really at the height of the pandemic to a city where this person was and review all the documents there. So it's these little things like that. Towards the end of my writing, there was a private investigator who was staking out my house, just in the suburbs of, just outside New York City. It's a weird, it's a little strange to answer your question because was I intimidated? I mean, Not really, to be honest with you. I think this kind of comes with the territory, and in some ways, part of the story that I was trying to tell was about a family and a company that got away with it for a long time. And part of the reason they got away with it is that they used these kinds of tactics. And so in the book, I talk about how, when you had a Purdue Pharma sales representative who sued the company for wrongful termination because she wasn't pushing their opioids as aggressively as they wanted her to be, and they fired her, they just crushed her. They lawyered up and they went after her. When Barry Meyer was reporting for the New York Times and did unbelievable groundbreaking reporting on Purdue Pharma, the company sent its lawyers to the New York Times and said, you have to take Barry Meyer off of the story. And for complicated reasons having to do with the institutional history of the Times at that particular moment, the paper did. It took him off the story. So,
And he wasn't happy. He was not happy about that.
He was very unhappy about it. And I should say, I've talked to many people at the Times who think that in retrospect, it was a big mistake to do that. But in a way, what's interesting to me about that episode is it's a story of two different institutional cultures. So what happened at the New York Times is just before Purdue went to them and said, you have to take your guy off the story, their claim was that he had a conflict of interest because he'd written a book. And so the Times took him off the story. Just before that, there had been the Jason Blair scandal, where there was a writer who was a fabulist who'd made a lot of stuff up and he'd got caught. And the Times, I think to its great credit, was kind of seized by this feeling of, like, my God, what have we done? We need to right the ship. We can never let this sort of thing happen again. So they were very vulnerable to a criticism from the outside at that moment. Contrast that with Purdue Pharma, which in 2007 pleads guilty to federal criminal charges and pays a $600 million fine, and just kind of keeps right on going, doing the bad stuff that it had been doing, and indeed pleads guilty to new criminal charges in 2020. So to me, this was quite interesting, right? On the one hand, I think anybody can look at the Times making that decision and feel that they were sort of bullied and manipulated. On the other hand, they were trying to behave in an institutionally responsible way, which is a very stark contrast to the way in which Purdue has conducted itself.
Eric, how about you? You've reported about the country's most powerful opioid distributors. Did they ever try to block your work? Did they ever try to intimidate you?
Well, first off, congratulations to Patrick. I've dealt with Purdue Pharma before. I haven't dealt with Sackler's, and it's really a nasty company. You should be congratulated for your courage, your conviction, your cojones, I guess would be the best way to put it. Great work. I didn't have any black limousines stalking my house, but there was a lot of threats of litigation from the Attorney General of West Virginia. When I got some leaked documents, I notified him that I was going to do a story about his role in this lawsuit against the distributors. And he had one of his underlings call our lawyer and email me that if we printed this story, it would be a case of actual malice and that we would face court sanctions. So I don't know what that meant. If that meant I was going to jail or somebody was going to jail. It didn't happen. He also, the AG retaliated he launched a investigation into the newspaper, the Gazette Mail that I was working at the time. And he subpoenaed us for all of our personnel records and all of our financial records. So that was in retaliation for what we had reported. And then last May, I heard at the landmark trial, we found out that the distributors had actually hired a consultant to, quote, turn the tide of my investigative reporting into the drug companies. Unfortunately, they weren't working to turn the tide of the opioid epidemic and reduce deaths. They were trying to basically derail my reporting and improve their corporate image, which was, of course, sagging at the time. The good news is that their plan didn't work. I'm still here in West Virginia, still covering the opioid crisis, and plan to continue to do so.
On that note, I think we're going to take some questions here from the audience, and there is one on West Virginia that maybe you can help us understand. It's from Betsy. She wants to know, why did some states like West Virginia opt out of the multi-state settlement on opioids? And I guess you'll have to give a little background on the MDL, but why did West Virginia? I think people are confused by that.
In a nutshell, it's because they didn't think they were going to get enough money from the national settlement. I've seen numbers close to $400 million that they would get from the national settlement. They think the state deserves a lot more than that. I think the people in the state feel the same way. We've got basically three different things going on. As you mentioned, the MDL, which is part of a $26 billion settlement that's on the table, and that's been moving forward. I think they've got 40 states that have signed on to that, and what they're doing now is working on the cities and counties to also sign up, and they have I think 2 or 3 months to do that. Then we have a pending case, Cabell Huntington. Huntington is the second largest city in the state of West Virginia, and they're suing the distributors. That case has concluded, and they're waiting for a judge to make a decision. And then there's also something called the mass litigation panel, which is most of these other cities, 60 plus cities, towns, counties, hospitals, school boards. They're separate from the MDL, but it basically boils down to they feel that West Virginia has borne the brunt of the opioid storm, and therefore we should get a lot more money than we're going to get out of the current settlement.
Patrick, there's a question here that you can help us with. So a few weeks ago, there was a settlement approved by a bankruptcy court in New York that dissolved Purdue Pharma. It's interesting how these companies go to bankruptcy court. We saw this with the drug maker Mallinckrodt also went into bankruptcy. But this particular settlement dissolves Purdue Pharma, requires the Sackler family to pay billions of dollars to address the opioid epidemic, but it's protecting them from further liability. And so I think people would like to know exactly what the court did and whether that's the end of the story. And we have a question from Susan who says, can you help us break down or interpret this week's DOJ action on the Sackler bankruptcy deal? Because I feel, my understanding is that the Justice Department this week just took action to block this controversial deal. So can you kind of walk us through all this, because it's pretty confusing?
Yeah, I mean, how long you got?
Well, it looks like we have about 7 minutes. So
right, exactly.
Keep it in 7 minutes.
Well, hopefully we'll get to, we have time for another question. Very briefly, in 2019, Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy. This struck some people as strange because it's a company that had generated a huge amount of money from OxyContin. So how could it be declaring bankruptcy? There were two answers. One is that there were thousands and thousands of lawsuits against the company. Every state in the union was suing them. But more importantly, over the prior decade, the Sackler family had pulled more than $10 billion out of the company. So they sort of siphoned all the money out and then kicked the company into bankruptcy. So this bankruptcy deal has been approved. What a lot of people find really galling is that the Sacklers themselves did not declare bankruptcy, but through the bankruptcy court, they have been given essentially immunity from any future civil liability relating to the opioid crisis. They've had to pay for this, so they've pledged that they will pay, over about a decade, they'll pay $4.5 billion. But that's it, and given the size of their fortune, it stands to reason that they can manage that amount of money. It's a lot of money, but it's tiny compared to the damage and what some would argue is their responsibility, and also compared to their remaining fortune. What happened this week is that the trustee of the U.S. Department of Justice, who was sort of helping oversee this or kind of monitor the bankruptcy, filed a notice of appeal and tried to kind of block this deal from going through. There are a couple of states that had already announced that they were going to appeal. This is significant and interesting kind of politically because it was during the last administration that there was a kind of an effort to wrap things up with Purdue and the Sacklers. And so you have a change of administration. That may be part of what's going on. But there also wasn't a formal objection by the Department of Justice, so it's a little unclear where this will go. But it does seem to trigger the appeal. which is very upsetting to people who wanted to see the deal kind of done and resolved. And we will now have to see what form that appeal will take. Does it go through the district court? Does it go right to the circuit court? Could it go eventually to the Supreme Court? And really at the heart of this is this question of, can a federal bankruptcy judge release from all future liability people who haven't declared bankruptcy before him, people who are not in his court as debtors? Does he have the power? Does a bankruptcy judge in White Plains have the power to say that for a certain sum of money, he will let the Sacklers go on their merry way and not have to face any liability in the future? I think I did that in 3 minutes.
You did very well. It's interesting, in all these settlements of billions of dollars, no one's taking responsibility for this horrific opioid epidemic that has claimed thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And you both in your books, your very tough, heartbreaking books describe the epidemic, the causes, the effects. Is anyone going to be held accountable? Do you think, Eric, why don't you take that first and then Patrick?
Well, with Purdue Pharma, Sari, as you know, I mean, they have multiple dozens of lawsuits were filed before the MDL against them. And every time they they would seal the records after seal the entire case file, which is absolutely unheard of in exchange for, the plaintiffs, the families that lost loved ones, agreeing to a certain settlement. So they were buying silence from all these families. I mean, that's thanks to Patrick and others. That's no longer the case. We know the real story. As far as holding individuals accountable, that's going to be probably not going to happen. They have done for some of the manufacturers. I don't see that happening with any of the distributors in terms of jail time or anything like that.
I would agree with Eric. I mean, I think that this is, and I should say, this is, to my mind, part of a deeper problem in the United States, which is that we are very, very accommodating of people who commit corporate crime, and we make it, our system, I think, makes it surpassingly easy for big corporations to effectively buy their way out of any individual liability. So what happens is, and this has happened with Purdue, the corporation pleads guilty and agrees to pay a big fine, but there's no individuals charged at all. And it sort of begs the question, right, to the man on the street, how can the corporation be pleading guilty to things if no individuals did anything wrong? Like, it's in my book, I say it's almost like it's a driverless car. How is it that it could have engaged in this misconduct without any human agency? But I'm afraid that's the way it works, generally speaking. And you can obviously contrast that with what happens when street-level drug dealers sell heroin or sell fentanyl. These people, often people of color, are held to account when people take those drugs and die for distributing them and sent away to prison for years. We don't see that in the corporate context. And what I worry about looking forward, looking at the next crisis, is what kind of a deterrent is it to people if they know that there's millions, billions of dollars to be made, and in the event that there's really negative downstream consequences, human costs of their bad decisions, that they won't ever personally be held responsible. They can kind of hold their head high, move on to their next job. The company will plead guilty, the company will pay the fine, and then they'll just keep moving. So to me, that's kind of one of the most dismaying takeaways from this whole story.
And Patrick, you might want to say what the highest payout is for victims of the opioid crisis. Isn't it like $35,000?
Yeah, and that's in the very extreme case in which you can prove, in the Purdue case, it's that you can prove that a relative died of an overdose of OxyContin. But I mean, you have all kinds of people who will get a few $1,000s, if that.
Exactly.
So our last question, and both of you can try to answer this. We don't have much time left, but this comes from Kay, who asks, what can ordinary people do to try to improve the opioid situation with regards to these corporations?
Say that again, Sari.
what can ordinary people do? So this is, ordinary people listening to this, reading your books, do to try to improve the opioid situation with regards to these corporations?
I mean, they could write letters to their legislators. I'm not sure that would do much good. On the ground, I know around here everybody carries Narcan, including myself. But I really, maybe Patrick's got some idea. I mean, there's these.
I mean, Patrick wrote a lot of, I guess, about some of the protesters who went to the museums, the Sackler museums.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that kind of protest has an impact. I think that with the Sacklers, it probably helps on some level that it's a family, so that it's a story you can tell. They're sort of personified in a way that like the board members of McKesson may not be, but I do think that public protest, I think getting out there on the street, I think letting people know that you're watching. Letting elected officials know, I think that some of the state attorneys general who push really hard to extract greater concessions from the Sacklers and Purdue, I think they were driven in part by the ones who are really earnest and out there and kind of driving the story. I think they were driven in part by contact with victims groups, with community groups. They had seen the way this played out in their own communities and had seen a kind of sense of outrage and a sense that there should be some semblance of justice and accountability here. So I don't know that it's enough or it could ever be enough, but I think that level of engagement does make a difference.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you to all of you who have been watching, and thank you to both of our extraordinary authors, Patrick Radden Keefe and Eyre. I really encourage you all to read their books. They're just terrific, important books. And enjoy the rest of the National Book Festival.
Thank you so much, Sari. Thank you.